Well, you may remember last Wednesday night we concluded our study of the kings of Israel and Judah. And I mentioned that moving forward, we're going to simply continue the story. We're going to continue with the history of God's people during their time in Babylon, and especially we're going to focus upon the time after their return, the time that they were rebuilding the city of Jerusalem and getting their nation reestablished. And then we're going to look at some of the things that transpired that brought about the system that was in place by the time that Jesus came on the scene. Because you stop and you think about, this ragtag bunch of people that had been conquered, they've been carried away, they're forced to be captives, and then they're allowed to go back, rebuild their society, and then reach the point where they became very prominent citizens, very well respected in their communities by the time of the first century. And so we're going to take a look at the history that led up to that, as well as we've seen in the previous lessons, some applications that we see in this. Well, where we left off last week, God's people are facing a time of discipline. They have allowed sin and the practice of idolatry and rebellion against God to lead to them being carried away by Babylon. But we find that even in this time of punishment, God was not going to turn his back on them. They were having to be punished, but God was not simply going to abandon them in this foreign land. After all, Ephesians 3, verses 8 through 12 talks about the fact that God had a plan in mind from the foundation of the world that would bring about the salvation of mankind, and part of that would include the Jewish people being able to come back from Babylon. They would go back and they would reestablish the city of Jerusalem. They would rebuild the temple and they would restore that Old Testament form of worship. And that would be in place at the time that the Messiah would come. And so once they were in Babylon, God sends Jeremiah. Jeremiah, most people believe, was carried away in that third wave, that last group that was carried to Babylon. And so we find that even while they're in Babylon, God continues to send messages to them through his prophets. And so shortly after arriving in Babylon, God sends Jeremiah with a message to these captive Jews, and he instructs them what they need to do if they're going to be successful in that foreign land. He said in Jeremiah 29, verses 4 through 7, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all who were carried away captive, whom I have caused to be carried away from Jerusalem to Babylon, build houses and dwell in them, plant gardens and eat their fruit, take wives and beget sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons, and give your daughters to husbands, so that they may bear sons and daughters, that you may increase there and not be diminished. And seek the peace of the city where I have caused you to be carried away captive, and pray to the Lord for it. For in its peace you will have peace." So first, notice the prophet starts out by reminding them that the reason that they're in Babylon is because that's where God wanted them to be. They were in Babylon at this point because God was the one who had facilitated this plan to bring them under this period of punishment. And it was because of their sins and their refusal to repent. But notice that he tells them, he says, even though you are there as captives, even though you're strangers in a strange land, he says, I want you to be productive there. He says, you go there, you build houses. You go out and you plant gardens. You continue living life as close to normal as you possibly can. Continue to marry and have children and bring grandchildren into this world, and continue to keep this nation alive even there in this strange land. And the message that he tells them is essentially, don't go there and sulk and pout and give up. He says, don't have this woe is me attitude. He says, no, you go and you make the best of this time. You continue to grow and to thrive. Well, they were going to be in Babylon for, there's differing ideas and different speculations out there. But somewhere between 3 and 5 generations of some families were going to be present in Babylon. They were going to be in Babylon for a period of 70 years. Now, some of those who were carried away into Babylonian captivity, we got to keep in mind, some of them were probably already married, already had children, so you're going to have multiple generations going into Babylon, and then as children are born, they're going to further that. And so they were told, you're going to be here for a while. You're going to be here for 70 years, and you don't want to be living in makeshift huts and tents for all that time. It says you build permanent structures. You put things in motion. Get settled in and live your life as best as you could. Because ultimately what God's desire for them was, He did not want them to become dependent upon anyone. Yes, they were there as the captives of Babylon. But something that we're going to see is Babylonian captivity was vastly different from what we saw when the children of Israel were in Egyptian bondage. Because generally, those who were carried away to Babylon, it wasn't just Judah. They conquered many different nations. But those who were carried to Babylon, so long as they, minded their P's and Q's and didn't press the system too much, they were essentially allowed to live in peace. They were allowed to continue to function and follow many of their customs. They weren't pressed into hard labor and forced to engage in things in servitude to the Babylonians, which was vastly different from what happened in Egypt. And that's why generally we see, their time in Egypt described as Egyptian bondage, but their time in Babylon is known as Babylonian captivity. They were captives, they were subject to Babylon, but they weren't forced into bondage by Babylon. In many ways, they still retained many of their freedoms. And so we find that God, through Jeremiah, is telling them, you need to realize how blessed you are to be in this place. Don't rebel against this system. Submit to them. Live your life. But notice that he tells them in Jeremiah 29 and verse 7, he says, seek after the peace of the city where you are going to live. Up to this point, the Babylonians had been their enemies. They were not having, good tidings and well wishes extended toward the Babylonians. But now they found themselves in Babylon, and now God is telling them, you need to seek after peace in this place. Don't live contentious, don't have rebellions going on. Because he tells them, he says, for in its peace, you will have peace. Meaning as long as you're striving to keep the peace, there's not going to be a problem. Well, you remember, and this is taking a little segue away from Babylon for just a moment, but do you remember what the arrangement was that the Jews had set up with the Romans in the first century? Anybody remember what that was? They were allowed to function separate and apart from much of Roman rule. They had to acknowledge that the emperor, that Caesar was supreme, that he was the supreme ruler. But so long as they did not try to usurp his authority or to rebel against his authority in any way, they could continue to live according to many of their laws. They could continue to have their own courts. We see this often when these nations fall into captivity. As long as they keep the peace, as long as they don't try to press any type of issue or rebel against the rule of their conquerors, most of the time they're left alone. They're allowed to function in peace. And so Jeremiah tells them, he says, while you're here, he says, make the most of this time. Strengthen this nation. Get it ready because you're going home. Notice he doesn't tell them how long they're going to be there. But it was going to be long enough that they needed to settle in. They needed to set up shop and be ready to stay for a while. And we know eventually, after 70 years, they're going to be allowed to go home. But notice that God even tells them, he says, don't just keep the peace with this nation. He says, I want you to even go so far as to pray for this nation to be blessed. Well, once again, that goes back to the fact They wanted this nation to be blessed because if that nation was blessed, they were going to be blessed. If some other nation came in and conquered them, they could have been pressed right back into bondage like they were in Egypt. But as it was, as long as Babylon prospered and enjoyed peace, the Jewish people were going to enjoy the same. And that nation was going to thrive. With that in mind, as Christians, oftentimes we find an analogy used that describes us as sojourners or pilgrims in this land. And like these Jews were told to do in Babylon, that's the same way that we need to conduct ourselves in this world. We need to be striving for peace. We need to be praying for the world around us. Peter wrote in 1 Peter 2, verses 11 and 12, he says, "Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation." He then goes on in verses 13 through 17 to tell us that we need to give honor to those who are in positions of authority. He says, "Therefore submit yourself to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors, as those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. As free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the king." And then you may remember when Paul is giving Timothy some instruction on what our prayers should include. In 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 through 4, he says, "Therefore I exhort, first of all, that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and the giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings and all who are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence, for this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth." And so this message that Jeremiah is bringing to these Jews is a message that could be brought to us today. Yes, we're going to spend some time in this world. We're going to spend some time here on earth. We need to settle in. We need to make the most of it. We need to be good, profitable citizens while we are here. But also we need to pray for those who are in positions of authority. Because if they prosper, we will prosper. Well, as we've noted, and just kind of bringing all of this back together in one tight package, let's consider just briefly this timeline of the Babylonian captivity and how it came about. We remember the first carrying away. We talked about that when we were looking at the reign of Jehoiakim. Nebuchadnezzar comes in and he carries away mainly young people. And these were young people who came from prominent Jewish families. And the reason for that is because they were going to be pressed into diplomatic service, trained in all of the ways of Babylon, so that when the other Jews got there, they would be able to step in as leaders of their people, but they would already be fully assimilated into their culture. This took place in roughly 606 BC. Then there was a second carrying away that took place 10 years later. So these young people spent 10 years in Babylon being trained. And then this second carrying away took place in 596 BC. This took place during the reign of Jehoiachin. And we're told that this captivity included mainly family members of nobility, those who would have been the leaders of those tribes who remained there. But also we're told that in this second carrying away, that many of the mighty fighting men, those who were young and had strength about them, they were carried away. But also during this time, the temple was ransacked, and many of the articles that would have been used there in the temple were also carried away. And then 10 years later, and so you have a 30-year period where every 10 years Babylon is coming carrying people away. So 10 years later in 586 BC, you have the third and final round of captivity that came during the reign of King Zedekiah. Now, as we talked about last week, this was the most brutal of all of the carrying away. It was during this time that Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. What was left was burned. Many people were taken captive. Many were killed. But those who were weak, those who were elderly, those who had health problems or disabilities, they were simply abandoned. They were left to fend for themselves. And many of them starved to death, and many of them who did survive were carried away as slaves by other nations. But once they arrived in Babylon, let's talk about this for a little bit. Once they arrived in Babylon, what was life like? Well, to get a picture of this, let's turn to the book of Daniel. As we did in our study of the Kings, we're going to jump around quite a bit between Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, but also some of the prophets to get a full picture of what was taking place. Well, the book of Daniel begins right at the end of the first carrying away. Because you remember, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were four of those young men from noble families who were carried away and were being pressed into the service of Babylon. But the book of Daniel ends just about the time that the first round of captives are allowed to go home. And so the book of Daniel essentially spans the entire 70 years of the Babylonian captivity. Now, if you read through the book of Daniel, you're going to find that not all of it is dealing strictly with history. You're going to find a lot of prophecy. You're going to find some apocalyptic language, kind of like the book of Revelation, that's kind of difficult to understand. But if you look strictly at the historical facts that are contained in the book of Daniel, it gives us a very good picture of what happens during that 70-year period. Well, from Daniel, we find that when they arrived in Babylon, they took the warnings that Jeremiah had been carrying to the people in Judah before being carried away. Remember, even before they were being told, submit to Nebuchadnezzar, do what Nebuchadnezzar tells you to do. And so these young people, when they arrive in Babylon, they do as they were told. They submit to what Nebuchadnezzar wants them to do. They settle down, they seek after the welfare of the city to such an extent that they really begin to prosper. Many of them, they reach the point where they even have high-ranking positions within the Babylonian government. We read about men such as Daniel and Mordecai and Nehemiah, who all rose in this hierarchical system of power that was there in that nation. But we find that over that 70-year period, one of the things that continually was taking place, this nation was growing in number and growing in strength each and every year. And with each passing generation, they were growing closer and closer back to God. Well, this was the whole purpose of this punishment. The whole purpose was to bring them back to God. And so we find that over this time, this was going to take place. Well, Babylon was a city that was vastly different from what Jerusalem was at this time. Jerusalem was a city that was generally focused upon, the Jewish culture and the worship there at the temple. Well, when they arrived in Babylon, especially think about it from the standpoint of these young men. Most of the sources that I looked at have estimated that the men who were carried away in that first captivity were anywhere from the age of 12 to 18. And you imagine they've been taken away from their families, they're carried away to a strange land, and they walk into a city that is unlike anything they've ever seen before. They walk into a city that is given over to idol worship. They walk into a city that is decadent in its promotion of sin. They walk into a city where the culture is completely different from what they're used to. The food is different from what they are accustomed to, what they're commanded to eat. California. Well, yeah, I mean, it'd be like us going somewhere that's we're not used to. But Babylon was a city that, unlike Jerusalem, it was a center of commerce. It was a center of culture. It was a place that that people would travel to engage in business. It was a place that people would travel to for education purposes. And so you had a lot of different types of people from different places, from different backgrounds and different religious beliefs. It was a city that was completely different from anything they had ever seen before. Now, on one hand, they could have looked at this as an opportunity. You know, we're away from home. Why don't we engage in some of the things that this city is doing? And I think there's evidence in the text that some did go along with the culture of the Babylonians. But we find that there were four, at least four that are mentioned by name. There may have been more. But there were four who would not go along. Yes, they would learn about the culture. Yes, they would engage in the things that did not cause them to go against the will of God. But you remember Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they, along with all of these other young men, were given what the Babylonians believed was the absolute best food that they had available. They were giving them the very same food that would be served at the king's table. So you see, they're treating these young men good. They're trying to indoctrinate them and get them into their system. But there were many of the things that were not clean. Things that were opposed to what the law of Moses allowed them to eat. And so these four men, they wouldn't go along with that. And so you remember, they proposed this idea, this contest, so to speak. And what they said was, for a period of time, let us follow our diet and let everybody else follow the king's diet. And when it's over with, let's see who's doing the best. Well, by the time that this was all said and done, these four young men were hands down the healthiest of all of those who were there. And they actually facilitated a change. The Babylonians agreed to allow these young men from Judah to follow those dietary customs that were a part of their law, of the law of Moses. And so even while they were there, even though they were captive, we see that even though that they were being given what the Babylonians thought was best, they were able to prove that God's way is always what's best. Because they were standing for what was right, what was in keeping with God's will. And they proved at the end of that time, through their health, through their physical condition, what really was the best situation, what really was for the best. Well, as we're going to talk about in a future lesson, but I'll give you just kind of a brief overview. After about 70 years, Babylon really is moving away from where they needed to be. God was the one that allowed Nebuchadnezzar to rise in power so that he could use the Babylonians to punish Judah. Well, as Judah was getting closer to God, as they were getting to the point where God was ready to let them go home, he knew the only way to facilitate that was he had to do something about Babylon. They were Babylon's captives. Babylon was not going to just turn them loose and let them go back home. And so what he did, he allowed another king and another nation to begin rising in power. In our next lesson, we're going to talk a lot about that king, a man by the name of Cyrus. Cyrus would become the first king of the joint Medo-Persian Empire. And what happened, God allowed Cyrus and the Medes and the Persians to rise in power to the point that they were able to go in and conquer Babylon. Well, the interesting thing is once they had conquered Babylon, Cyrus didn't care anything about these conquered people. He didn't care if they went back home. Now, all along, God was the one who was facilitating this. It was God's providence that was working all of this out. But we find that God was the one who put a king in power to carry out his will in punishing Judah, but now he's put another king in power that's going to facilitate his will of letting them go back home. And so after 70 years, they're going to be allowed to start leaving. And just as they were carried away from Judah in 3 waves, they're going to be allowed to go back to Judah in 3 waves. The first was going to be under the leadership of a man named Zerubbabel. Now, I may not be pronouncing that right, but this was in 536 BC. Babylon had fallen in 539, and 3 years later, Cyrus makes a public proclamation that the Jewish people were going to be allowed to start returning home, to go back to their homeland. And we could look at the book of Ezra, the first 6 chapters, the prophet Haggai, the first 2 chapters, and then the entire book of Zechariah. These all cover this first return. The first wave of people who go back to Jerusalem with the intention of rebuilding the temple. Now, we'll talk about that more in detail also as we go along. We're just looking at an overview tonight. The temple is finally going to be rebuilt around 516 BC, which is going to start the period in Jewish history that's known as the Second Temple System. Also, many people believe that the book of Esther took place during this time period as well, as people were beginning to leave and go back home. Well, then you had a second wave of captives allowed to leave. And this was under the leadership of Ezra. This was in the year 458 BC. Now this date is debated. You know, there's about an 8 to 10 year period there where people debate exactly when it took place. But we know that the purpose of this second return was first off to get there and to remind the people who had gone back initially what they were really supposed to be doing. Because they had gone back and they had started rebuilding the temple and then they quit. And they started building homes for themselves and let the temple continue to lie in ruins. Well, Ezra shows up on the scene with these other people and he gets them back to work. But Ezra's main focus is restoring the law. Getting the religious observances of the old law back into place. Also, as we read in Ezra 7 through 10, he spends a lot of time on the ornamentation of the temple and restoring those things that were necessary in order for them to worship in the temple. But Ezra's time is also marked by a shift. And this is where we really start seeing a change taking place from the way that this system of worship under the old law was prior to Babylon to the way that it's now going to develop and continue until the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. What's going to happen, and we see this, Ezra chapter 7 and verse 6. Ezra is the very first person that we ever see described as a scribe. He's described as a scribe skilled in the law of Moses. And we find that from this point forward, you're going to have a new class of religious elites that are going to rise in power. Now, prior to going to Babylon, who was seen as the most prominent religious leaders in those communities? The priests. The priests were. Well, now, from the time of Ezra moving forward... Go ahead, Nick. Yeah, I mean, there were regulations there for all of it. Oh. Oh. But looking at this, you see this system of people, the scribes. They come to be known as the wise men among the Jews. No longer were the priests the ones that were in charge of instructing people. No longer were priests the ones that were seen as the main religious leaders in those communities. You had people who became, so to speak, highly educated in the old law. They devoted their lives simply to knowing the old law and interpreting the old law. Well, what would happen is the priests eventually would move into more of a ceremonial position. They were there to carry out the rituals that would take place at the temple, but they really didn't do any teaching. They were simply there as figureheads. They were the public image. But if any type of teaching had to be done, if there were any disagreements that had to be handled, the scribes were the ones who stepped in and did that. So moving forward from that time, no longer, and I mean this is a first deviation that we really see from the law of Moses after they came back from Babylon. The priests essentially relinquished a lot of their authority to the scribes, a position that was never authorized under the law of Moses. But also we find that as time went by and prophecy became less and less prevalent, we find that the interpretations of these scribes began to be seen with the same degree of authority as a message from a prophet. Now, the messages that the prophets brought, where did they come from? From God. God was the one who inspired them, that they gave them those prophecies. A man simply reading the old law and giving his interpretation of it, is that on par with someone who's inspired of God? No. But that's what developed among the Jews. They developed this mentality that if this is something that a scribe is teaching, it has to be right. The scribes are the experts. They're the lawyers. They know the law.
Well, you had a population and most of them didn't read, and then you had this man who could read, and he read the scriptures, and he said, "This is what it says."
That's right. And you saw that carried down for generations. I mean, even in this country, up until around the mid-1800s, you still had a large portion of our population here that wasn't able to read and write. And so, yeah, that's right. That's right. But then when you have individuals who begin to push their interpretations or push their ideologies like you had with these scribes, you begin to see how the law of Moses became so different in its interpretation by the time of Christ than it was when it was initially given. And it was because they were following the interpretations of these men rather than following actually what the law of Moses taught. Just real quickly, you had a third and final return. There were some that stayed in Babylon, a small number. You go back and you study the history of the Jews. I've watched some videos on YouTube. To me, it's fascinating because I love history. But there's so many different segments of the Jews that ended up because you had some that were dispersed to different parts of the world and how they all intertwined with each other. But this main group that came back, that reestablished Jerusalem, reestablished that nation, the last of those arrived in Jerusalem in 445 BC. And so now the temple's rebuilt, the nation is restored, and when Nehemiah returns with these last people, they set about rebuilding the walls, getting the city protected so that another nation would not be able to come in and overcome them. So we're going to stop right there. And then, as I said, next week, we'll spend most of our time talking about Cyrus and how he rose to power and the part that he played in bringing these Jews back to Jerusalem. So we'll stop there for tonight.